There are some filmmakers synonymous with greatness. Because of the lasting impact and influence of their work, it's easy to believe that they are incapable of producing anything except a masterpiece. But we must remember that these people, despite their talent, are only human. Every now and then, they'll put out a blockbuster, slasher, or a drama that's less than stellar. And so, with that in mind then, I'm Ellie with Whatculture, here with 10 worst movies by the best directors. Number 10, Noah by Darren Aronofsky. After releasing Requiem for a Dream, The Fountain, The Wrestler and Black Swan, Darren Aronofsky was set to be the next big thing. But after Noah hit theatres, that potential came tumbling down. What's really frustrating about this dud is how there are so many magnificent moments trapped inside it. The cast are phenomenal. The visuals for the angels, the serpent and the Garden of Eden cannot be faulted. So what's the problem? Although it was never going to be easy to create a live-action movie based on the most famous story in the Old Testament, Aronofsky added some elements that were dumb. As soon as the movie begins, rock monsters called the Watchers are introduced. Because these creatures weren't in any promos, many viewers thought they were watching the wrong movie at first. Another decision that did this biblical retelling no favours is depicting Noah as unjustifiably cruel. Although we're meant to be rooting for this guy, that's impossible after watching him leaving innocent women to die and trying to murder his newborn grandchild. Even though he eventually comes to his senses, it makes you lose all respect for our supposed hero. Number 9, The Adventures of Sharkboy and Lavagirl in 3D by Robert Rodriguez. In his early career, Robert Rodriguez was renowned for his ultra-violent, action-packed thrillers. But as his children grew up, he focused more on kid-friendly features. So when his son Racer came up with his own story, Rodriguez thought it would be cool to adapt it for the big screen. As touching as that gesture is, Racer's saga, The Adventures of Sharkboy and Lavagirl in 3D, is beyond terrible. The performances range from cartoonish to wooden. The story is nonsensical. I know the scriptwriter is 7 years old, but that's no excuse. The special effects are so badly rendered, you'd think the footage was a pilot for a cancelled children's show. The next time Rodriguez's kids tell him they have an idea for a movie, he should just say, never again. Number 8, The Witches by Robert Zemeckis. For many, Robert Zemeckis didn't just make great movies, he made our childhood. Due to his work on the Back to the Future trilogy and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, there are millions of movie lovers who are eternally grateful to Zemeckis for all the joy he brought us. So when he announced he was making an adaptation of Roald Dahl's The Witches, we were thrilled. Even though the 1990 version is a movie many hold close to their heart, it felt like Zemeckis was the perfect director to have another crack at this classic. But not only was The Witches the weakest movie of Zemeckis' career, it was the worst adaptation of Dahl's work. It makes Tim Burton's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory look like the Shawshank Redemption and Citizen Kane had a movie baby. Despite the phenomenal casting, this stinker is let down by distractingly awful CGI, an imprecise tone, and a jarring over-the-top narrator. Even though there are plenty of people who were scared by the original, at least they remember it. As soon as the credits roll on this pointless remake, you'll immediately forget what you just watched. Number 7, The Dilemma by Ron Howard. This comedy centers around a guy called Ronnie who discovers the wife of his best friend Nick is being unfaithful. Ronnie knows he needs to be honest with his friend, but is also aware that telling the truth will destroy Nick's life. The Dilemma has every trope you can imagine: excessive slapstick gags, sex jokes, rambling improvisation, characters unnecessarily murdering animals, you know, the usual. So when you discover this travesty was concocted by none other than Ron Howard, you are left dumbfounded. Imagine if you learned Christopher Nolan was the director of Hot Tub Time Machine, or Sam Mendes was the guy behind Little Nicky. That's why it's so surreal to see the same director who created A Beautiful Mind, Apollo 13 and Arrested Development devised a comedy of such inadequate quality. Number 6, Survival of the Dead by George A. Romero. There are so many uncreative zombie flicks overstuffing the horror genre, you'd assume a movie titled Survival of the Dead was just another trite zombfest, feebly attempting to recreate the scares of George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. However, this film was made by George A. Romero. But because of the shoddy camera work and dire editing, you'd swear Survival of the Dead was put together by a film student, while drunk and blindfolded. What makes this sequel worse is how pointless it is. The story revolves around a group of humans who are trying to decide whether to kill zombies or cure them. That's a great idea, which was already done in Romero's third zombie outing, Day of the Dead. Because Survival of the Dead brings nothing new to the table, you wonder why Romero was inspired to make it. If you were considering giving it a gander just to check out the gore, don't bother. Number 5, Hulk by Ang Lee. Even though Ang Lee had never directed a superhero flick before taking the reins on the Hulk production, no one doubted he could bring the goods. Early in his career, the Taiwanese filmmaker proved he could handle any genre. Even though it's easy to harp about the Jade Giant's imperfect visuals, they were up to par when Hulk was released back in 2003. However, that is the least of the movie's problems. The sparse action is layered in so much darkness you can't tell what's happening half the time. Despite the superb cast, every performance feels wrong, except Nick Nolte, who is delightfully over the top. Although you have to commend Lee's attempt at making the scenes resemble a comic book by inserting tiled shots, it comes across as distracting, gimmicky, or unintentionally hilarious. Number 4, The 1517 to Paris by Clint Eastwood. For the last half a century, Clint Eastwood has proven to be among the most consistent directors to ever live. He may have churned out some clunkers, but the good definitely outweighs the bad overall. Having said that, one of Eastwood's most recent features, 1517 to Paris, might very well be the worst thing he's ever directed. The film tells the true story of a trio of Americans who stopped a terrorist attack on a train to France. Saving the lives of over 500 passengers, these men were instantly hailed as heroes. When you phrase it like that, this biographical drama sounds like the type of feel-good flick guaranteed to win Oscars. So why did it turn out so badly? Simply put, the lead performers. Instead of hiring professionals, Eastwood thought the story would feel more authentic if the main characters were played by their real-life counterparts, Anthony Sadler, Alex Garlatos, and Spencer Stone. Although this is an interesting approach, it didn't work. Sadler, Garlatos, and Stone are such bad actors that you never believe they could stop a terrorist attack, even though they did. Number 3, The Lady Killers by the Coen Brothers. The Lady Killers was a hilarious comedy from the 1950s revolving around a criminal mastermind whose attempts at robbing a bank keep being accidentally thwarted by his elderly landlady. Normally, people are up in arms when they hear the words reboot, but when the Coen Brothers announced that they would be helming the remake of The Lady Killers, things seemed optimistic, since the original's quirky tone felt suited to the director's style. Considering this adaptation has some hilarious performers, including J.K. Simmons, Marlon Wayans, and Tom Hanks, the film appeared to be in very safe hands. But for some reason, what should have been a classic in the making didn't come together. Even though the Coen Brothers etched their funniest scenes with clever wordplay and precise writing, this film is hampered by cartoonish jokes involving IBS, a lady's butt, and Tom Hanks mugging into the screen every 5 minutes. Plus, the gags feel so old-fashioned that they would have been considered out of date if they were used in the original version. Number 2, 1941 by Steven Spielberg. Despite his influence on cinema, Steven Spielberg has crafted a few blunders. The BFG was a mixed bag. The Lost World Jurassic Park failed to capture the magic of his predecessor, but even when Spielberg mishandles a movie, it's usually not downright awful. Except for 1941. Although making a slapstick comedy about Pearl Harbor sounds like a recipe for disaster, it could have worked if it was in the hands of someone like Mel Brooks or the Zucker brothers. Hell, Spielberg himself could have pulled it off in his later years when he was more experienced. Sadly, Spielberg completely bungled this travesty. Nearly every joke falls flat. Any gag that garners a chuckle goes on too long until it becomes cringy. To Spielberg's credit, 1941 was only released 3 years after he made a name for himself with Jaws, and it was clear the young director was still experimenting with his craft. Number 1. Twixt by Francis Ford Coppola. Because Francis Ford Coppola cranked out so much cinematic gold in his early career, it seemed impossible to maintain the impossible standard he'd set for himself. Sure enough, his later works such as Jack, Youth Without Youth, and Tetro were a far cry from the movies that defined him as a visionary. But there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that can prepare you for how badly his 2011 horror flick Twixt turned out. The story follows a failing author called Hal, who finds himself involved in a murder mystery after he has a vision of a ghost. If that sounds like an interesting premise and you're curious to give Twixt a go, stop what you're doing and watch the trailer, since words cannot convey how amateur this movie is. Because of the diabolical camera work, school play special effects, and its grubby visuals, you may have difficulty believing Twixt came from the same man who redefined cinema with The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. Worse still, there's no one else you can possibly blame, since Coppola couldn't have had more control over this project if he tried. Not only did he direct Twixt, he produced it, wrote the script, and devised the initial idea. I know every film should be given a chance, but even the biggest Coppola fans would be advised to skip this abomination completely.